counterterrorism mission was the cornerstone mission of DHS. The thinking at the time was that terrorism was an extraterritorial threat from beyond our borders. Now, the terrorist threat has evolved to a point where it's principally domestic-based, domestic-inspired, white, violent nationalism, extremist nationalism.
Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara with Teneo Political Risk Advisory in New York City. Jeh Johnson is with me today. He was our nation's fourth Secretary of Homeland Security, serving 2013 to 2017 during the second Obama administration. He's had a distinguished career in both public service and the private sector. Previously, he served as the General Counsel of the Department of Defense, the General Counsel of the Air Force, and as an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. Today, he is a partner at Paul Weiss. That's the law firm where he started as an associate back in 1984 and where he became the firm's first African-American partner. He is on the boards of Lockheed Martin and U.S. in addition to the Council on Foreign Relations in Columbia University, which is where he got his law degree. Anecdotally, Secretary Johnson's father, also a Jeh Johnson, was a professor of architecture at my alma mater, Vassar College, where I got to know him as well, some too many years ago to count at this point. Secretary Johnson joins us today thanks to the efforts of our mutual friend and colleague, former New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being here today. And, you know, you and I spoke a couple of weeks ago, and I walked away from that conversation thinking about how our talk today should go. But I think in light of some recent events, stretching back now a couple of weeks, I've had to rethink that a little bit. So I want to start perhaps by asking you kind of a big framing question. You know, when the Department of Homeland Security was formed, it was born out of the 9/11 attacks and involved the reorganization of agencies, of personnel, of budgets and resources, ostensibly to protect the United States from further foreign attacks. And I think in many ways, we've been very, very successful at that. And I know that the remit of the agency is much bigger and more expansive than that. But I have to say, you know, following the news from Uvalde, Texas, and before that, Southern California, and before that, Buffalo, and so many other places, and January 6th, and Charlottesville, and Antifa, and the list goes on and on and on, that the rot is coming from within, and that is as big a threat to our homeland and to our national security as any foreign threat is. And so I wanted to ask just your perspective, not only from your previous positions, but a lifetime of public service, how you see that dynamic right now.
Kevin, thanks for having me. The answer to your question is that it is an evolving picture. And to be frank, the model for the Department of Homeland Security that was created in 2002 by Congress is now outdated. When Congress created DHS, it was, like everything else in Washington, a political compromise. In some respects, some would say that Congress went too far in consolidating all these different agencies into one cabinet-level department. And in other respects, it didn't go far enough. It was a political compromise. But the underlying thinking at the time and the motivating reason for the creation of DHS obviously was 9/11. Counterterrorism. The counterterrorism mission was the cornerstone mission of DHS. The thinking at the time was that terrorism was an extraterritorial threat from beyond our borders. All the 9/11 hijackers were from beyond our borders. And so the thought was, if you consolidate into one cabinet level department, the regulation of all the different ways someone can enter this country, land, sea, and air, or at the ports, you've done a better job of regulating who enters this country. You've done a better job at combating terrorism. Because then terrorism was an extraterritorial threat. During the first Obama term, I was general counsel of the Department of Defense. Part of my job was giving the legal sign-off for a lot of our counterterrorism operations. Back then, in the 2009-2012 period, and preceding that, in the Bush years, we were very focused on decapitating Al-Qaeda's leadership. And so, very often, I would sign off on these objectives, going after Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Shabaab. I gave the legal sign-off for our special forces to go into Pakistan to get Osama bin Laden on May 1st, 2011, at the time when terrorism was an extraterritorial threat. So we were taking the fight to these foreign terrorist organizations overseas. There was then an evolution. We did an effective job at degrading a foreign terrorist organization's capability to launch another large-scale 9/11 style attack. We went from what we refer to as foreign directed attacks to foreign inspired attacks, where terrorist organizations like ISIS would inspire a lone wolf actor here in the United States to take action through an attack on a workplace or a shopping mall or a movie theater or a nightclub, inspired by something they saw on the internet put out by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And much of that occurred in the second Obama term when I was DHS secretary. Now, the terrorist threat has evolved to a point where it's principally domestic-based, domestic-inspired, white, violent nationalism, extremist nationalism. And the reason I say that the model is outdated, there are not a whole lot of DHS cops running around the interior looking for terrorists. DHS is principally at the borders, at the ports, at the airports, the Coast Guard, TSA, Customs, Border Patrol, regulating, enforcing that old model of doing a better job of ensuring who's coming into this country. The principal task now of combating terrorism in this country has fallen to the FBI. There are things that DHS can do by way of grant making to local law enforcement. When I was in office, I was focused on engaging community-based organizations, combating violent extremism, but the principal law enforcement role has fallen to the FBI, and as everybody knows, the thing you most often hear associated with DHS now is the issue of immigration. On the backdrop of all of this, Kevin, are these large-scale shooting incidents like Texas, like Buffalo, that simply happen over and over and over again. Whether to label it terrorism or something else depends very much on the state of mind of the assailant, the motive of the shooter. In 2016, after I believe it was after the attack on the nightclub in Orlando, Florida, I decided to say publicly, there are all these things we can be doing to address terrorism here in this country, but if you really want to get at safer homeland security, we do need to address the prevalence of guns in this country, the easy availability of guns, assault weapons in this country. I was reluctant to then dive into the gun safety debate, but I felt like I had to. As the Secretary of Homeland Security, my remarks were mischaracterized as saying, Secretary says DHS should now take on gun control as its mission. That's not what I said. But this is the backdrop for the repeated acts of violence we see over and over and over again. Um, there are mental health issues. There are issues around, you know, violent white nationalism, but the backdrop of all of this is the prevalence of guns in our society.
Can I ask you to maybe put on your lawyer's hat here for a second and help us distinguish between, just sort of crime, as extreme as it might be, and this concept of domestic terrorism? Because there is no statute defining domestic terrorism. I think we can define terrorism very well, the use of violence to coerce a political outcome in a sense. But
Yes.
how should we think about this concept of domestic terrorism?
My answer is going to be the same, I believe, as the FBI directors, which is that Title 18 of the United States Code punishes terrorism, whether it's foreign based or domestic based. I believe that we have ample legal authority to combat and prosecute acts of terrorism in this country. The question is resources, investigative capabilities, rooting out extremism at its roots, at its core, at its beginnings, the early stages, and then having effective investigative tools to find these guys before they can turn violent. I don't believe that we need a statute that punishes domestic terrorism specifically. There's already a statute that punishes acts of terrorism in this country, whether it's Al Qaeda, whether it's some domestic-based group.
Do you
And your
think that it
definition of
is?
terrorism
Yeah,
is essentially correct. It's violence directed at innocent civilians to try to bring about some sort of political outcome.
right. In your sense, is this broadly defined domestic terrorism? Is this something that is getting actually worse? I mean, I think our history is quite extensive, that at various times we've had very concentrated violence around extreme xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, around racism, around anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. Is it getting worse, or is it just a perception that we're at a moment where it's particularly bad? But this is something that there's a cadence to it over our history.
I believe it is getting worse. The Anti-Defamation League tracks this, and ADL will tell you that acts of terrorism committed by violent white nationalists now outpaces acts of terrorism in this country inspired by, directed by foreign terrorist organizations. I believe it's getting worse because I believe that the lid has been peeled off a lot of prejudice, bigotry, hatred in this country. These groups, these individuals feel emboldened to bring their hatred out in the open. I think a crucial turning point was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August 2017. These groups, these individuals have manifestos. They feel that some segments, perhaps, of the political leadership in this country secretly endorses this. Some of the stuff that we see on social media, on cable news, does not help. It may even be emboldening it to some degree, but I believe it is getting worse, and I think that can be documented.
And it is, and I think I know the answer to this, but is it your sense here that the biggest concern could be thought of under this kind of general term of white supremacy or ethno-nationalism, if you will? Because there's a lot of pushback out there, obviously, that comes from, I guess, what you'd call the whatabouters, right? What about this and what about that? But when you step back and you look at the aggregate, it seems pretty clear that that's where the big sort of threat is. Is that fair?
Recent polls indicate that an alarmingly large segment of the American population fears the so-called Great Replacement, which is what motivated the shooter in Buffalo a couple weeks ago. Great Replacement theory that people of color in this country are here to take over from white Americans. I'm not going to cite the percentage because I'll probably get it wrong, but it's an alarmingly large number of people. Polls, surveys suggest that it was a motivator for, in part, the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol. And one interesting fact, there's a study that was done by a Professor Robert Pape, University of Chicago, the demographics of the January 6th insurrectionist. And there was something that surprises a lot of people, including myself. Most of those arrested come from blue states, not red states, from blue counties that Joe Biden won that are trending more diverse. That's the principal demographic of those arrested on January 6th. So it's people from Putnam County, New York, people even within, my county, Essex County, New Jersey. The shooter in Buffalo was from, deep blue New York State, a different part of New York State. And so the so-called Great Replacement is a motivating factor for a lot of the hatred we see. And it exists within communities where you would not expect to see it. We're not talking about remote areas of deep red states. We're talking about urban, semi-urban areas of blue states and blue counties.
So how do we, I want to go back to something you said earlier, talking about the broader or the original kind of war on terror, if you will. That in many ways it's been very, very effective, not least because we successfully took out so many of the leaders. As you mentioned, while at Department of Defense, it was you who signed the legal authorization to launch the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. But that's much more challenging to do in the United States for a whole host of laws and civil liberties reasons and et cetera, rightful assembly and all of that. So how do we interrupt and arrest the recruitment of people who aren't actually the groups are oftentimes very loosely organized without real leadership. There's a lot of quote unquote self-radicalization that's occurring on the internet and the like. So you sort of lone wolf, but still highly inspired attacks that occur. What can be done to interrupt that narrative, that continuum?
A couple of things. One, when I was at DHS working with federal law enforcement, DHS has a lot of federal law enforcement agencies contained within it, and with the FBI, there were countless numbers of plots to commit acts of violence that were prevented. The American people would take comfort in knowing the number of plots we interdict at a very early stage that you don't always hear about. When somebody who harbors extremist views has turned toward actively thinking about violence, committing an overt act in furtherance of a scheme to commit an act of violence. So there is a point beyond which someone who harbors a certain belief goes to actively thinking about committing an act of violence. And there are a number of things that can be done. One of the things that I valued most were the grants that DHS gives to local and state law enforcement every year to fund efforts at Homeland Security, counterterrorism, like, for example, surveillance cameras, as long as they work in subway stations. But surveillance cameras, in the city of New York and the island of Manhattan, where I'm sitting right now, there's surveillance, just about everywhere these days. So if there's an assailant on a subway, if the cameras work, you're most likely going to see that assailant fleeing the scene or at the scene. So grant making to local law enforcement, because federal law enforcement cannot be everywhere. Effective tools at investigations, undercover investigations. We do a lot through undercover agents, informants, getting at violent extremism. And then one of the things that I was pleasantly surprised to learn when I was at DHS, there are a handful of groups, community-based organizations, devoted to helping those who are leaving neo-Nazism reform. There's a group in Chicago called Life After Hate. I think they're called something else now, that we wanted to fund. We wanted to provide a grant to at DHS. And there needs to be more of that out there. And I mean, we can get into the whole subject of social media and what to do about it there. But there's a lot that can be done without changing the laws per se, from the earliest stages of steering someone away from violent extremism to focus on investigations, to helping local law enforcement, and then the actual prosecutions of these acts and the prevention of these acts.
You know, it seems you've takes us to a sensitive moment, right? Because it highlights two other drivers here, which is one, which is very difficult to contain. You kind of touched on it, which is the role of the large tech social media platforms, and you know what, if any, responsibility they either have or are going to be held to in the future. The second is, of course, our own elected officials, and the role and responsibility they have in ensuring that all voices are heard, but that discourse is held in, you know, societally acceptable ways. And I feel as though we have failed on that front in recent years, to be sure, but that didn't come out of nowhere. There's been a coarsening of civil discourse in this country for a long time, aided and abetted by, you know, 24-hour news and talking heads and all of this. But, you know, the horse has bolted the barn, right? I mean, how do you get the genie back in the bottle? If I can keep mixing my metaphors here, but I mean, how do we get our elected officials and community leaders and everything back onto that page, that we're actually on the same team here? We see it in some moments, like our approach to Russia, Ukraine, perhaps to some degree on our approach to China, on these international threats to our national security. But at home, it doesn't feel like we've been this divided since 1968 or since the Civil War era.
So that's a very big question. I have a lot of thoughts. First, whenever I ask somebody, either an historian or somebody who's been around politics forever, hey, have you ever seen it this bad? They'll say, yes, it's always been this bad. Or yes, you know, right after the Civil War, right before the Civil War, or yes, during the 1960s. I have, that aside, it feels bad to me. One of the reasons it feels bad to me is our elected leaders simply find it in their political interest to play to their extremist base versus the broader electorate in what they say and what they do. I have given speeches, written op-eds about the importance of responsible behavior in rhetoric among those, and I include myself in this, among those of us who command a microphone. We have a responsibility to be responsible in what we say and what we advocate. People really do listen to their leaders, whether that person is an elected official, an appointed official, or a host of a cable news show. People do listen to their leaders. And extremist rhetoric makes extremist thoughts acceptable, and for the deranged few among us, violent behavior inevitable. On the subject of, and so encouraging people in positions of leadership to be more responsible in their rhetoric, I believe, tracks back to the voters and the constituents, the consuming public. We need a different set of metrics for how we assess successful leadership in this country. Why don't voters assess their elected officials by what it is they're actually getting done in Washington? Why don't we put out a report card for every member of Congress? How many bills did you sponsor and how many of those bills got enacted into law? Versus just taking an extremist position, standing in your extreme corner, yelling at the other side, hoping you don't get a primary opponent. Why don't we start assessing our elected leaders by what it is they actually get done? When I was in Washington, when I was at DHS, we had a sign over my door that said, "We get shit done." And that's what we should be electing our representatives to do, to get stuff done for the public good. So if the American people, if voters, would simply begin to grade their elected officials by what it is they're able to do by reaching across the aisle, achieving political compromise, and getting stuff done. And that's what it requires in Washington. Getting stuff done requires compromise. Compromise requires reaching across the aisle. So we need a different set of metrics for how we reward these people in Washington. On the subject of social media, look, 16% apparently of Americans, not 16% of Republicans, not 16% of a subset, 16% of Americans ascribe to the QAnon theory that our government, media, financial services are run by Satan-worshiping pedophiles. 16%. That's 1 in 6 Americans. 1 in 6 have gone off the deep end to believe that. They didn't get that from USA Today. They're getting that from stuff they see on social media. I represent and advise a number of clients in this space, so I'll freely disclose that. And a number of them have taken steps in the right direction to regulate, monitor, control, ban extremist rhetoric that could lead to violence. But it's like chasing ghosts. The shooter in Texas apparently posted his intentions. The shooter in Buffalo put it online as he was committing his acts. It was taken down very quickly. But a lot of social media is a forum for extremist thinking, extremist behavior. There are tremendous virtues to social media. You can hold the whole world in your hand. But without impinging upon the First Amendment, without impinging upon freedom of speech in a free society, I believe that all big tech needs to do a better job of trying to control and police the extremist rhetoric that is available online that reinforces a lot of violent behavior.
Yeah, and just to add to something you said, I believe there are several dozen, I saw a number as high as 40 people running for office in the midterm elections this year who have espoused some of the QAnon theories out there themselves. You brought up a few minutes ago immigration, and I want to turn to that here in just a moment. But something that's been kind of absent, other than sort of the origin concept of DHS, has been international terrorism. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on kind of where we are on that. We don't hear about it that much. So, how big is the threat in your view right now? I would note also that until the shootings in ISIS took over the news cycle on Tuesday, the big headline was that the FBI had gotten involved in or stopped an ISIS-inspired potential assassination attempt against former President Bush. So it's still out there. What's your sense of the status?
Well, hold on a second. Where's somewhere in this room is my shredded, hold on, my last intelligence briefing. Shredded, where is it? I can't find it. Maybe somebody took it. It was all shredded. It was my last PDB. So I can't give you an informed answer to that question because I'm not reading daily intelligence reports anymore. I know what I don't know, and there's a tremendous amount. By the way, the best question people used to always ask me when I was in office, how safe are we? The best question to ask somebody who's in government, who's in national security, is how big a gap is there between what you know and what I know? Is it this big or is it this big? So I know what I don't know about the terrorist threat to the homeland at the moment. I do believe that foreign terrorist organizations these days are, for the most part, we're talking about ISIS, ISIS-K, Khorasan Group, Al-Qaeda, what's left of it, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, what's left of it, Al-Shabaab, are focused on local aims in the regions in which they exist. Some of them, and I know this from experience, some of them actually are capable of thinking semi-rationally, which is, if I attack the U.S., I become the focus of the U.S. And I don't want to be the focus of the U.S. I'd rather focus on Somalia or Yemen or Afghanistan. I don't want to draw the attention of the United States. So some of these groups actually are capable of thinking along those lines. On the other hand, they know that attacks on U.S. interests can be high profile and are good, frankly, for recruiting. But for the most part, it would appear that foreign terrorist organizations are focused locally on their aims. ISIS, Al-Qaeda's principal objective as it pertained to the West, as it pertained to the U.S., was to drive us out of that region. And we're largely gone from that region now. You're right. Occasionally, we do see plots like the one that was apparently interdicted against President Bush, but it's nothing like it used to be 10 years ago, 5 years ago. The shoe bomber, the underwear bomber, attempting to blow up a commercial airliner over Detroit, or what have you. We have been, as you pointed out, and as I pointed out earlier, we have been largely successful in degrading foreign terrorist organizations' ability to launch an attack here in the United States, a foreign terrorist organization's directed attack here in the United States, like another 9/11. Knock on wood.
So I want to turn the conversation now to the immigration challenge, especially at the southern border. It's an issue that has clearly bedeviled Republican and Democratic administrations alike, and it clearly promises to be a major factor in this year's midterm election. So what's your current view on this, and what can be done that's both effective and at the same time upholds, our traditional ideals and welcome and harbor and empathy and so on and so forth? And I know you've advocated, for really going after some of the root causes that cause people to leave parts of Latin America, Central America in particular. But what can be done in the short term?
Kevin, I owned this problem for 3 years. It's so much easier to assess the solutions to the problem sitting on 6th Avenue and 51st Street, as opposed to when you're in the thick of it. Barack Obama used to say, this would be really interesting if I wasn't caught smack in the middle of it. Immigration, border security, illegal immigration was the toughest issue I wrestled with in public office. Tougher than counterterrorism, Guantanamo, gays in the military, cyber, and the like, because it is such an emotional issue. There are solutions. There are solutions. There are answers to these problems, but they are politically unobtainable. So here's my big picture assessment of this. First, illegal immigration is a very market sensitive, information sensitive phenomenon. Illegal immigration reacts sharply to information about perceived changes in enforcement policy in the United States. So if the perception is the U.S. government has lacked on enforcement, that's going to cause a rush to the border. Encouraged by the smugglers. The smugglers are like used car dealers, selling something where the sale expires at the end of the week. Got to go now, they're letting everybody in now, or they're lifting Title 42, got to go now. So illegal immigration reacts sharply to information about what's happening on our border. We had a spike in May 2014 when I was in office. We had 68,000 that month. Now, you got to put that in context. These days, it's over 200,000 a month. 68,000 at the time, felt like the world was coming to an end. But we did things to enhance enforcement. And I made a big deal out of it publicly that drove the numbers down. So by July, August, it was over. And the numbers stayed low for the next year or so. So there are things you can do that you have to do, and they are unpleasant. And I'm not talking about separating parents from their children. That was just inhumane. But there are things we can do and we have to do to enhance enforcement, to regulate border security, which most Americans want. Corollary to that is that you can do things to enhance enforcement, but they will have only a short-term effect at best on the numbers. As long as the underlying conditions exist, the push factors in Central America, in Mexico exist, they're going to keep coming, which is why, as you mentioned, in my judgment, it is so important that we try to address the underlying reasons why people are leaving Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador in the first place to keep coming here. We started that in the Obama administration. The Trump administration suspended it. I know President Biden believes in this because he and I talked about it when he was vice president and I was secretary. That's the long-term solution to this problem, which has to occur over the course of several administrations. And there has to be a real commitment to addressing this problem. There's a lot you can do to enhance enforcement, enhance surveillance, building a wall in places where it makes sense to build a wall, not everywhere. But as long as the push factors exist, we're going to continue to bang our head against the wall and deal with this problem.
Yeah, and it seems like, with the upcoming Summit of the Americas, it sounds like some of those Central American countries are not going to attend, given the U.S. not inviting Venezuela and Cuba. And so that conversation at that head of government level is just even further pushed out, and that doesn't help matters at all. I'm conscious of the time, and there's a couple other subjects I want to touch on, so I'm going to move on here. And I want to turn to cybersecurity here for a moment. And to kind of get your sense of how that threat has evolved, and particularly from the perspective of corporate America now, where you see the most acute threat and the like. But I'm also interested in hearing your thoughts as to why, at the outset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a lot of concern that this sort of mythical Russian and Russian-inspired cyber army was going to launch a lot of attacks against, critical infrastructure and the corporate world in the United States and in Europe. And for the most part, anything catastrophic by all appearances has not actually transpired. And why do you think that that is? Has it been successful defense? Has it been that they haven't done it? Some combination? What's your thought?
You're right. Cyber attacks on the U.S., on the West, by Russia, in reaction to the invasion, so far is the dog that hasn't barked yet. So far as we know, I don't have a good explanation, except perhaps the Russian government realizes that if they launch a large-scale attack, they're provoking a large-scale response from the West, which they don't need right now. That's the best explanation I can offer based upon public sources. In terms of the cyber threat to the United States, you have to break it down and categorize it. There is traditional surveillance activity, which is very traditional. It's just in its new modern form in cyberspace, which all sophisticated governments do against one another. There is theft of intellectual property. The defense industrial base, for example, sees this problem over and over again. Theft of defense technology by other governments. There's ransomware, which is getting a lot of attention right now, which no one is immune from. And then there's the thing that I worry about most, a DDoS attack, an attack to degrade or destroy a capability, which can be launched from malware implanted months before. So a lot of systems would have existing within their lock and key malware that could be activated on a moment's notice to destroy a system. And to me, that's the biggest cyber threat. That type of offensive attack is the biggest cyber threat. But cyber attacks in our country in general are becoming more and more prevalent. It's a bigger deal. Nobody's immune. In corporate America, in academia, government, anybody that warehouses vast amounts of private personal data is not immune. And they tend to be the targets of this kind of thing. Whether it's a hospital, whether it's healthcare, whether it's a university, whether it's a hotel chain, an airline, nobody is immune. And so cybersecurity, and you referenced this earlier, Kevin, cybersecurity needs to be a front and center discussion among corporate boards and senior management of a lot of public and private companies. I know because it's frequently front and center in our discussions in the boards I serve, and it needs to therefore be something not just simply consigned to the responsibility of the chief information officer or the chief security officer. It needs to be a front and center topic for the CEO, for directors, because a cyber attack can be a game changer for a public company.
In general, do you think we're doing an okay or good job at that? I mean, the disaggregated responsibility for all of this, as well as corporate needs to protect, protect sort of their vulnerabilities from their competitors, as well as would be bad actors, malign actors. It seems like there's not necessarily, beyond sort of general practices and principles, a lot of coordination and a lot of good cooperation, public, private to private. Where do you think we are in the spectrum of how well we're doing on that front?
My observation is that there are huge differences in the levels of sophistication in the private sector when it comes to cybersecurity. The financial services sector, large banks, the defense industrial base, large defense contractors are very, very sophisticated, almost as sophisticated, if not as sophisticated as the federal government is in terms of cyber defenses. But there are huge supply chain issues, and there are huge issues among less sophisticated entities that don't devote enough of their budgets to cybersecurity. I have believed for a long time that there needs to be certain basic federal standards for cybersecurity, in certain business sectors, in critical infrastructure. There are 19 critical infrastructure sectors in this country. The most recently created one was one I created as I was leaving office, election infrastructure. But there's a lot of critical infrastructure in this country. Something like 80% of it is in private hands, not public hands. And there ought to be minimal standards. We have minimal standards for aviation security, driver safety, chemical facilities, nuclear facilities. There ought to be minimal federal standards that the most sophisticated among us are probably already meeting to get everyone else in line. When I left office in 2017, I was disappointed that we had not achieved a good and effective level of public-private partnerships. There's a lot of distrust of the federal government in the private sector when it comes to sharing information about cybersecurity. Looking at it from the outside, I think that has changed somewhat. I think Chris Krebs, the first director of CISA, the newly created cybersecurity agency, has done a good job, did a good job before he got fired, of establishing credibility in the private sector. I think CISA's been off to a good start. There's a lot more we can do in terms of public-private partnerships. One of the things we can do is eliminate the confusion that exists about the roles various different federal agencies have when it comes to cybersecurity. The simplest way to look at it is that the FBI are the cops and Homeland Security, CISA, are the firemen. Cops find the bad guys, the firemen put out the fire and do the forensics and do the patchwork. And as I said, there's a lot of the level of sophistication among a lot of entities is high, but it's still very much a work in progress in the face of increasingly aggressive, creative, tenacious, bad cyber actors out there.
You know, everything we've been talking about today, not least of which is the cyber issue we've just touched on, but quite frankly, all of these politically sensitive issues, not to mention the supply chain risk, climate change, all of this is directly impacting boards and C-suites. And it seems like the skill set that a CEO needs to be able to navigate all of these waters and to be able to respond to all of the stakeholders that are demanding attention on this, from your employees to your customers to your shareholders to the media to your regulator to elected officials, everybody. How are you now advising your clients on how to navigate this sort of it can be existential to their job, quite frankly, if they don't get through this well. How are you talking to them now?
The best advice, which is not advice, not legal advice, my best advice is the CEO, the directors, all need a go-to person who is a cyber expert, whether it's the chief, whether it's the CISO, the CIO, a go-to person who can explain this topic in English. I had one at DHS. The first one was stolen by Citigroup. The second one was stolen away from me by Goldman Sachs. And finding somebody who, A, understands cybersecurity and knows what to do, and B, can explain it to the boss in plain English is so crucial. I've encountered a lot of people who know a lot about cybersecurity, just like a lot of people who are expert on financial services, on echocardiography, on any complex topic, who simply can't explain it in English. When you can find somebody who can explain it in English to enable the decision maker to make the informed decisions about how much of the budget to allocate to this, or whether to pay a ransomware demand or not, is critical. And anybody who's in the C-suite uh, of a large public company in particular needs to have someone at their right hand who is capable of doing that.
So when I was going through your bio at the beginning of the call, I mentioned that you're on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations. So let me have you put that hat on for 1 second here. Why do you think that, you know, the corporate response of America and a lot of European companies to the Russian invasion was, all things considered, I would say, lightning fast. Some companies walking away from decades of investments, others, at least suspending operations until they figured out where this thing was going, et cetera. But they took action very fast, and in ways that stand in sort of stark contrast to, say, other political events, certainly domestic political events, where a lot of times they seem like they're deer caught in the headlights, in a way, and they've got competing. What was it that there was something so egregious about the Russian action that it made it, that it was a moment of clarity, that others are a lot fuzzier, or what was unique about Russia that got that level of concerted self-sanctioning, quite frankly, of corporate America?
I'd say a couple of things, and that's a good question. One, the issue of conducting business in Russia did not get caught up in domestic politics, like a lot of other contentious issues can and have, where corporate America feels like it's being forced to take sides in a political debate. What, in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, rarely have the battle lines between what is good and what is evil been so clear. So, weighing a decision to withdraw an investment in Russia was more a dollars and cents issue, alongside of doing what is right socially, internationally, without being caught up in the heated domestic political debate. I thought that the public listing of companies that were there who were not there was also pretty effective. Nobody likes to be on the wrong list. And so that's my sense of it. I think the fact that no one in corporate America could responsibly defend Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine makes this a somewhat simple and relatively easy choice to make, notwithstanding any continued business interest there.
So I want to end our conversation today kind of where we began, which is looking at the state of our nation at the moment. A few minutes ago, I asked you the question about Russia's the sort of the lack of Russian attack, cyber attack on the United States following the invasion of Ukraine. And I would argue that maybe we should be looking not at what they're doing here, but look at what they're doing everywhere else, and not just Russia, but China as well. And that is the sort of the propaganda and disinformation campaign that they spread around the world through cyber capabilities as well. And that is to put things like Texas, things like Buffalo, things like Charlottesville, things like January 6th on endless loop, and to say that is what democracy is. That chaos over there, that attacking each other is so maybe the end of history is not what America has been selling, and that there's a better way. So I guess my question to you is, it seems like there is a continued decline in the American electorate's trust in its institutions. We obviously know that, Congress's approval ratings sort of compete with, the New York City subway rat for how popular they are. And we know following the, some of the actions taken at the Supreme Court, that even institutions that have traditionally ridden high in American esteem have been in now several years worth of decline. And we've got this level of polarization in the country. Are you concerned about the state of democracy? Do you think that this is just a sort of a valley in the constant amplitude of this grand experiment of democracy that we've been running for 200 plus years? Or is it true that democracy in human history is certainly not the natural state of things, and that experiment is really being put to the test right now?
The short answer to your question is yes, I am concerned, and you're correct. Democracy is not necessarily a natural state of affairs. You have to work at it. Human impulse very often is toward autocracy, fascism, isolationism. You have to work at democracy. Somebody said, it's yours if you can keep it. There was a polls taken back in the 1950s during the Eisenhower years, post-World War II, that revealed that something like 70% of Americans trusted their government to do the right thing. Those numbers, as you might guess, are now much lower these days, except notably the U.S. military and surprisingly emergency response, FEMA. While I was in office, I was pleasantly surprised to see that the numbers of Americans who trusted FEMA to do the right thing in response to a national disaster high. This is going back 7 or 8 years ago. I don't know whether that's still true.
But that came off a low after Katrina, right? Where FEMA's approval ratings must have taken a big hit.
Craig Fugate's leadership, I think FEMA came back a long way. Right. I do worry. The shooting in Texas. I'm as appalled by the shooting as I am our inability to do anything about it. The inability of our democracy to do anything about it. Recall the shooting that occurred in New Zealand. The mass shooting. There was a new gun law in New Zealand like within a week because it was so obvious that this was a problem that needed to be addressed. I worry that there is a national security threat simply by the polarization of our democracy. People used to say, will it take a crisis to bring us together? Well, we did have a crisis called COVID 20 and 21, but the crisis quickly lapsed into a highly political debate about who's at fault and whether or not mask wearing will solve the problem, and the whole vaccine versus libertarian debate. And that was a crisis, and 1 million deaths didn't have to be that bad. And one of the reasons it was that bad is our inability to find a national purpose, national unity in addressing that problem. I worry that if there were another 9/11 today, we would quickly fall into a debate about whose fault it was. Was it Al-Qaeda or Antifa? Something along those lines, where there'd be basic deniers about the very event. I believe that I'm still an optimist about the strength and durability of our democracy in our country. I believe that the answer, like so many other answers, tracks back to the expectation of voters. The good news is that more and more people, every presidential election cycle, are participating in our democracy. Levels of voter participation are going up every 4 years. If we can just simply incentivize voters to incentivize their elected officials to simply get stuff done versus taking extreme stances on different issues, yelling and demonizing the other side so that nothing gets done. If we can incentivize voters to incentivize their representatives in the right way, we could get back on the right track.
Yeah, somebody once said it's very difficult to get somebody to believe something when their livelihood depends on them believing something else. And that goes as much for elected officials as it does for any laborer in an industry that's ripe for disruption. Secretary Johnson, I want to thank you for your time and your insights today on a wide range of subjects. We really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and to remind you that we'll be back in 2 weeks on June the 9th. My guest will be Alan Murray, the CEO of Fortune. He's got a new book about to be released called Tomorrow's Capitalist. He'll be joining me on Thursday, June the 9th. So until then, I want to wish everybody a happy Memorial Day weekend and their start to summer. And to thank you all for joining me today, and particularly thank you to former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jeh Johnson. Thanks so much. Have a great day. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York.